A cessationist is someone who believes that certain spiritual gifts, typically the more miraculous ones, ceased to be given by God to the church sometime late in the first century AD, or sometimes more gradually through the course of the next few centuries. Now, cessationists do not typically deny that God can, on occasion, still perform miracles, like healing people. But they don't believe the spiritual gift of miracles or the spiritual gift of healing is given to believers today. And of course, we'll talk about those gifts later on. They would say that whereas healing still exists in the life of the church, healers do not. God's people may still experience miracles, but no longer empowers miracle workers. As a continuationist, by contrast, I believe that all the gifts of the Spirit continue to be given by God and are therefore operative in the church today and should be prayed for and sought after. Now, most cessationists and continuationists agree that at least some gifts continue and at least one gift has ceased. Cessationists believe, for example, that gifts like teaching, evangelism, mercy, and so on are still given by God and will be until the end of this age. And many continuationists believe that at least one spiritual gift, that of apostleship, has ceased or has been withdrawn from the life of God's people. But again, this will depend entirely on how we define apostleship, and we're going to devote 2 sessions to that toward the end of our series. So we will take up those issues at a later time. But before we look at the biblical arguments in favor of cessationism, I just want to share a brief conversation I had with a close friend who's a committed cessationist. I asked him why he embraced this view of spiritual gifts. And it was interesting that his initial response wasn't to point me to biblical text or theological principles. I eventually got around to them, but they were not his first line of defense. Instead, he pointed out that the doctrine of continuationism, this idea that we should pursue and practice the miraculous gifts of the Spirit, is in his mind inseparable from the Word of Faith movement, as well as the more extreme expressions of the so-called prosperity or health and wealth gospel. And he also mentioned the offensive and excessive flamboyance of certain TV evangelists and other manipulative tactics that are oftentimes disguised as ministry. He was also concerned about losing control. And then, of course, he said, I just see a disparity between what I read in the New Testament about those gifts and what I see in contemporary charismatic churches today. And his argument was, if these gifts are still valid, shouldn't the same quantity and quality of miracles in the first century be repeated in the 21st? Now, I mention these factors simply to point out that there is sometimes more at work under the radar, so to speak, in the minds of many cessationists than simply the appeal to certain biblical texts. This may not be true for all cessationists. I'm not suggesting that it is. But it is important to keep it in the forefront of our thinking as we examine the arguments cited in defense of this position. Now, what are some of the texts that cessationists appeal to? Well, the most famous, of course, is 1 Corinthians 13, 8 through 12, in Paul's so-called love chapter. There we read, love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. And then Paul says, we know in part, we prophesy in part. But here's the phrase, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. And then Paul continues, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known.